Good morning. I'm Daryl Brugink, Executive Editor with No-Till Farmer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's No-Till Farmer webinar. We're coming to you from the No-Till Farmer Studios in Brookfield, Wisconsin, and pleased you could join us for today's discussion on ways to make your cover crops more impactful and improve your pastures if you have livestock. Today's No-Till Farmer webinar is sponsored by Truax Company, and they are the makers of the On-the-Go Seed Drill and the Flex 2 Series Grass Drill. We'd like to thank the folks at Truax for making this webinar possible. And here to help us learn more about what he's learned is Gabe Brown, the owner of Brown's Ranch in Bismarck, North Dakota. Gabe has spent a lifetime of overcoming challenges with implementing no-till and learning to work with a diverse system of crops, cover crops, and livestock over nearly 3 decades. And we're pleased to have him sharing his experiences with us today. Now, before we turn things over to Gabe, there are a couple items we want to make you aware of. On your screen, you'll see a control panel that opens an orange box with a white arrow inside of it. Now you can click on that and it's going to open up a comment field that will allow you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, we will look to share as many of your questions as possible with Gabe. Now, if for any reason the webinar is disrupted or you are seemingly disconnected from the webinar, just go back to that invitation email you received and rejoin the webinar through the web link in the email. So with that said, thanks again for joining us. I want to turn over the controls to Gabe. Good morning to you, Gabe. I hope things are going well for you this morning in southern North Dakota. And I understand, like a lot of folks this year, you are praying for a strong shot of rain.
Well, thank you, Daryl. It's a pleasure to be here today. Yeah, we're a bit on the dry side, entering our third year of well below normal precipitation, but it's okay. We can, through soil health, build resilience to our ecosystems and thus help mitigate at least some of the effects of dry weather. First, I want to thank No-Till Farmer for hosting this webinar, and of course the Truax Company for sponsoring it. Due to limited time, I'm going to move rather fast through this today. So I'm going to touch on a number of different topics, and then, as Daryl said, we'll entertain questions at the end. And then any of you who are watching or listening to the webinar, feel free to contact me at any time. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. So with that, the first thing I have to get people in the right mindset. And one of the things I think that is a real issue in production agriculture today is we don't realize what we have done to our resource by and large. And I tell people I have the good fortune of being on thousands of farms and ranches all over North America every year. And I've never been on a single one, including my own, that's not degraded. So we can't feel bad about that. We just have to come to the realization that we truly can regenerate our resources if we put our minds to it. The photo I'm showing you now on the screen is one that was just taken 2 weeks ago, and there's a team of scientists that is doing some in-depth studies on our property to see the effects of regenerative agriculture. And on your left there, that's some of my cropland soil that's been farmed and ranched regeneratively for 25 plus years. And then on the right, that's actually right across the road, a neighbor's Perennial Pastures. And look at the difference in that soil. It's absolutely amazing. And the scientists that were here were amazed at the difference that can come about just through management. So I'm going to share with you this morning some of our management practices, and hopefully it'll give you an idea or two as to maybe some things you can implement on your operation. First thing we all have to come to the realization is that there's these 5 keys to achieving a healthy soil. And no matter where I travel around the world, as long as there's production agriculture, these 5 principles are the same. Now, the tools we use to achieve these principles may be a little different as far as seed species used, crops in the rotation, different types of livestock, etc. But the principles are all the same. Very quickly, they are least amount of mechanical or chemical disturbance possible, armor on the soil surface, plant diversity, and I'll add to that animal and insect diversity also, living root in the ground as long as possible throughout the year, and the integration of livestock onto the cropland. So those 5 principles, I don't care whether we're talking a cropping system or a grazing system, we need to keep in mind at all times. The first thing that producers need to do, and we're going to jump right into the cover crops, is we need to determine what our resource concern is. I will average 100 to 400 emails and phone calls every day. And the most often asked question is people want me to choose their cover crop mix. I can't do that. I don't know your resource concern. And I really try to stress to producers, you need to determine what are your resource concerns? What is it you're trying to do with that particular piece of cropland or grazing land? Only once you determine that can you then design your cover crop mix. And this can be everything from adding diversity to adding more soil armor to building soil aggregates in order to improve the water cycle. If you have a pest problem, we can design cover crop mixes to mitigate that. If you want to build organic matter, improve nutrient cycling, and the list goes on. But there's no way you can determine what cover crops to plant until you've determined your resource concern first. So why do we want diverse cover crop mixes? If soil health is your goal, crop diversity cannot be ignored or overstated. Plants evolved over time and were created to grow in diverse ecosystems. Look what we've done in production agriculture today. We plant monocultures. This is exactly contradictory to how healthy ecosystems function. Resiliency comes from diversity. The more diversity you have, the more resilient your operation is going to be to anything that comes against it. The other thing is we want to feed a balanced diet to soil biology. And you can't hardly pick up a publication nowadays without there being at least one article in there about soil biology and the importance of it. And you know, I've heard it said recently that scientists know more about how to land on the moon than they do about the soil biology under our feet. We need to, as producers, come to the realization that our profitability relies on a healthy soil ecosystem. So the more we can learn about soil biology and the more we can do to feed and propagate that biology, the more profitable we're going to become. And the fifth point there is balance, because even good things, when not used in moderation, can be harmful. One of the things we're really seeing, and there's some good work out there that's showing that if you have too many legumes in the system, you're actually going to decrease your water infiltration rates over time. And so we're running into some of the real issues, especially in the Intermountain West areas or those areas that are really concentrated dairy operations where they have a large amount of pivots that are they're removing alfalfa hay from, legumes hay from in order to feed these dairies. We're seeing a drastic decrease in the infiltration rates and the soil health in general on those acres. So we need to keep that in mind as we move forward. So the photo I have up on the screen here, this is one of my native paddocks. And my son taught rangeland management at the local community college for 5 years. And he brought his students out to this paddock. And in a 2-hour time frame, they collected over 140 different species of grasses, forbs, and legumes. Now, that's a tremendous amount of diversity. So my question is, why are we in production agriculture so hung up on planting monocultures when that's not how nature evolved? And so we can add that diversity through cover crops. Okay, here's a question for you. This is an actual photo taken in southeastern Alberta. Look at that. That's a spring triticale crop. Now, that's nothing to brag about there, right? Notice very short heads. Most of the plants are not even headed out. Now you go right next to it, a little bit of difference, huh? That's pretty healthy growing plants there with good size head on those triticale plants. Now, the amazing thing is they're side by side, planted the same day. The only difference is the diversity was added to one versus a monoculture in the other. This was one large field, and then they just split it and did some trials there of the difference between a monoculture and a diverse polyculture. There's no difference in the kind of seed used, there's no difference in the fertility package, anything. The only difference is the diversity. I don't know how anyone can look at that photo and not realize the importance of diversity. That's Dr. Yamili in the pink there. She was in charge of this study, and it was pretty eye-opening to see that striking difference. And this is what we're seeing. Now think of production agriculture today. We're fixed on this monoculture production. Is that how nature functions? No. Why are we fixed on it? We need to open our minds and think broader than what we're doing. Dr. Chris Nichols, who many of you know, she was the lead scientist at Rodale Institute, and now she's a private consultant. She explains it this way, and she's talking about mycorrhizal fungi. Not only do the fungi provide for the needs of one plant, but the fungal hyphae pipeline connect to multiple plants. This helps satisfy the nutritional and energy needs of both microorganisms and the plants. So that's why we need diverse ecosystems so that we can move nutrients throughout the soil profile and thus benefit all plant species. It's the diversity that drives soil health. You know, I'm located here in the northern Great Plains. At one time, it had very deep, rich topsoils. What caused that? You know, it evolved over time from tremendous diversity and with ruminants grazing on it. So just briefly, as we talk about diversity, we need to realize there's 4 different crop types: cool season grasses, cool season broadleaves, and I've only listed some of them here. And then we have warm season broadleaves, warm season grasses. Now, it absolutely amazes me how I travel around North America and so many producers think the only thing they can plant is corn and beans. And what's that doing to the soil resource? We need to add cover crops to the rotation in order to feed that soil a balanced diet and to build and advance soil health. Now, there was some really good work done out there by Dr. David Tillman, and he's talking about on the left axis, we have plant biomass. On the bottom, we have species diversity. Look at that. As we increase the species diversity, look at what it does to biomass production. Last year here in south central North Dakota on our ranch, we had 5.8 inches of rainfall. Yet I double crop cover crops and I was still grazing a sorghum sudan based cover crop that was 6 to 8 feet tall. How did that occur in such dry conditions? The answer is from just what we see on our screen. I had the diversity of plant species in order to advance soil health and be able to transfer those nutrients like Dr. Nichols talked about. So people often ask me, how many species of cover crops do we need in a mix? And I tell them we want, if at all possible, at least 7 or 8. Now, obviously, there are situations such as if you're in the northern part of the country, there's only so many species that'll overwinter. There's only so many fall biennials that we have access to. You may not have that many then, but try and get 7 or 8 species in a mix, and you'll see a tremendous increase in plant biomass. Now, Dr. Tillman also did some work on functional diversity. Again, plant biomass on the left, functional diversity groups on the bottom. What we're talking about there is things such as grasses, forbs, legumes. And in pasture situations in particular, we want to make sure we have that diverse mix, some of each of them. You know, I spent a lot of time traveling throughout the South and the Southeast, and it absolutely amazes me how many pasture situations we run into, whether there's only fescue growing, you know, there's monocultures out there. Well, we're not taking advantage of these principles of nature and using them to our advantage to put more profitability in our pocket. So we want to look at diversity of functional groups also. We need diversity both above ground and below ground. You know, there's many different root types. There's fibrous roots, tap roots, and then we want to make sure that we're hitting all areas of that soil profile. And one of the best ways to see that, of course, is to dig a soils pit. Although all those who know me know that I just despise digging the soil on my own land. But you can learn a lot from digging a soils pit and see just how many areas of that soil profile you're really getting those roots into. Roots, of course, build organic matter and cycle nutrients. And that's how our soils were formed over a large amount of time, is with the diversity of plants and with all those diversity of root types. I just really like this photo and I had to put it up there. If you look closely, you can see the small annuals there, and then look at the perennial roots there. Look at the difference in them. And I tend to chastise some of the plant breeders nowadays who are giving us, quote unquote, these new improved genetics. They're spending all their time focused on grain yield and no time focused on root biomass. Approximately 2/3 of your organic matter increase in your soil over time will come about from roots. Yet, how many of us are really paying attention to the root biomass of the species that we're seeding on both our cropland acres and into our perennial pastures? We need to spend more time looking at that. Here's a really good photo that I think illustrates several points. This is a wheat field that was seeded. What's the difference? Why is there that stripe of markedly better wheat in that line there? It was all seeded the same day, all the same inputs. There's no difference. Well, what you're looking at there is that's an old fence line, and they tore out the fence line and just seeded through it. Isn't it amazing the difference that carbon makes in the ecosystem? What you're seeing there is the result of carbon that carbon has on that wheat. I claim this: soil carbon is the key driver for the nutritional status of plants and therefore the mineral density in animals and people. Soil carbon is the key driver for moisture holding capacity. Soil carbon is the key driver for farm profit. As I travel around the world on different farms and ranches, I often state that I can tell the potential profitability of any farm or ranch by the amount of carbon they have cycling in their system. Ask yourself this: when was the last time your agronomist talked to you about soil carbon? You need to fire him or her because they don't have your best interest at heart. It's soil carbon that makes the biggest difference. And our goal as producers, whether we're in a perennial pasture situation or in a cropping situation, is how do we cycle more carbon into our system? And it is a cycle. We hear this all the time about carbon sequestration. Well, we need to cycle the carbon. Right now, there's too much in the atmosphere. We got to get it back in our soils where it can drive profitability for our operation. Here's what we've been able to do on our operation over time. And soil organic matter is only one indicator of soil health. And soil organic matter will fluctuate over time. But in 1993, our last year of tillage, our organic matter levels on our cropland were 1.7 to 1.9%. Today, they're from 5.3 to 7.9%. So we've significantly increased the ability of our soil to both hold on to moisture and to provide nutrients. I ran these figures just here last winter, the value of soil organic matter. 1% soil organic matter equates to about $750 worth of NPK and sulfur. Now, if you up your soil organic matter to 5%, look at that. That's money in the bank. It absolutely amazes me how many producers want to write checks for these inputs when they're easily obtainable if we grow cover crops and cycle these nutrients. We can get the majority of nutrients a plant needs out of the atmosphere if we focus on a healthy ecosystem. So, getting into the cover crops, the first thing we have to determine is where do we have a gap in time that we can fill with cover crops? Now, I spend a lot of time in the corn soybean belt, and they say, well, we can get rye started after corn or rye after beans, but that's about it. Well, then it comes down to each individual producer. What are you willing to do to improve the overall profitability of your operation, which can be improved by focusing on this nutrient cycle, the carbon cycle? Sometimes we have to expand our crop rotation in order to allow us that gap of time where we can grow covers. You know, that we can do a little bit through intercropping, which is becoming more and more prevalent, but I don't want people to think that they're going to be able to advance soil health to the point that they can significantly back off their synthetic inputs by just doing some intercropping. It takes much more than that in order to really back off of those inputs. Now, for those livestock producers, I strongly recommend you develop what's called a forage chart. Just take a look on the left there. I've listed some of the forages we have in our operation and when they're at their nutritional and production peak as far as biomass is concerned. Cool season natives, warm season natives, thanks to the wonderful government and their CRP program, we're inundated with smooth brome and Kentucky bluegrass here. And so, you know, those are a forage. And I look at all plants as forages. You know, too often we look at many of these species as weeds. In my mind, if livestock will consume it and they receive nutrition from it, it is not a weed, it is a forage. So list all of those and then determine when do I need to seed a cover so I can fill in those nutritional gaps that my livestock may have. So put together a chart like that. It's well worth your time and it'll really help you in some planning. Now, one of the things that we've done a lot of on our operation, I'm just going to give you an example of different cover crops and how we fit them in our operation, is these fall seeded biennials. And most of the northern plains has the opportunity to seed these fall biennials. That's rye and hairy vetch pictured right there. I use a lot of cereal rye for this reason. One rye plant can have over 6,500 miles of roots and root hairs. Think about that. How would you like to be the grad student who dug all that up and had to measure it all? I mean, my goodness. One of the things, though, rye has been less influenced by plant breeders. The root biomass has been influenced less by plant breeders than many of the other cereals. So we need to take advantage of that when we talk about cycling carbon and increasing organic matter. Now, there's several things I can do with this cover crop mix. I do not usually hay it, but it certainly is an option. And it provides some decent quality forage for my livestock if need be. For those of you with a feedlot or feeding animals in a confinement type situation, which I certainly encourage you to get livestock out on the land, but if you're doing that, take a look. This is some of the work I did on my place. A rye monoculture yielded 9 tons per acre. That's of a wet forage, 9% crude protein. Rye mixed with vetch, 14 tons per acre, 14% crude protein. Just by adding that one legume species, look at the difference in tonnage and of nutrient quality. Makes a huge difference. This photo was taken in 2006. I took it. We had less than 1.5 inches of rainfall on that particular rye vetch crop. That's without counting the snow we had. But look at the production I got off that, even in a drought situation. Now, one of the things we do with this, and I often, as I travel about, especially through the Corn Belt, oh, Gabe, you don't understand. We can only grow corn and beans. It's the only thing that's profitable. I just laugh at that. What you're seeing here, this is my average net profit per acre for the last 9 years from my rye vetch combination. And I am selling it as seed, but you'll notice on the right, I have my seed cleaning costs, my marketing costs in there, labor, storage, etc. But I've averaged a net profit of over $900 per acre. How many corn and bean growers have done that net profit over the last 9 years? We have to open our minds and realize there's other crops that can be grown. And the beauty of this, I'll show you coming up, is that we can follow it with the cover. Now, I really like grazing this rye vetch based mix. That shows, the photo there shows we were calving cow-calf pairs out on it. They do extremely well. We can also graze yearlings on it. Now, we can use it to address many resource concerns. Here on this particular field, we were lacking armor on that cropland field. So we purposely let the rye vetch get to a more mature state, and then we mob grazed yearling heifers on there. Obviously, waiting till that state to graze, is not conducive to high average daily gains, but that wasn't our resource concern at that point. It was simply putting armor on the soil surface. There we're moving them. We did multiple moves per day. And look at the amount of armor or carbon that we're laying down on that soil surface, protecting that soil, addressing that resource concern. That's just a close-up of what it looked like. Now, the beauty of it is we get all that dung and urine on that soil, and we're also terminating that cover crop by grazing it at that point in time. Now, the vetch is going to come back if we have rainfall, but that's okay. But the rye is terminated. Here's the economics of that. We grazed 187 yearlings on there. Net profit per acre was $185. But think of all the enhanced value to soil health by applying that carbon. Plus, we're improving the soil health of our perennial pastures by allowing them more rest and recovery time. Now, immediately following that, you can tell in the photo that the rye was terminated. We go right in there and then seed a very diverse cover crop mix. Tremendous amount of diversity in this mix, and I'm not going to take time right now to go through each one of these individual species, but each one of these has a specific purpose, specific reason that we're seeding them. You know, there's grasses in there for the tremendous amount of root mass they put on. There's legumes to fix some nitrogen in there. Sunflowers, deep taproot, safflowers, buckwheat attract the pollinators. You know, same with Phacelia. Plantain, I'll show you a photo of that coming up. All of these species serve a specific purpose, and you can learn about them through various websites on cover crops. SARE has a very good book that's available for download free, Farming Cover Crops Profitably. I encourage you to look at that book. This is what the seed mix looks like. And I often get asked, Gabe, how in the world do you seed that? It's really pretty simple. You just set your drill So the largest seed will flow through, and away you go. Now, too many people ask, won't that small seed settle? And the answer is it'll settle very little unless you're doing a really large acreage. And if you're doing a large acreage, then you'll obviously want to agitate that seed some. But you're planting a cover crop. It doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, how deep do you plant it? This is a photo of my operation. I like it planted about 3/4 of an inch deep, so you get good seed soil contact. But I wanted to show this photo. The large seeds will break away for the small seeds, and the small seeds will come up. It really works much better than one thinks it would. And the fact of the matter is, as you advance and improve your soil health, you're going to find every year it becomes easier and easier to establish a stand. It's to the point now on my operation, it's pretty hard for me to screw up and not get a stand established. It just, when you have good soil aggregation, you're going to be able to get a good stand. Here, this shows cowpeas emerging through that residue. Now, how many weeds are really going to germinate through that amount of that rye residue? It works really well for inhibiting weed growth. If you are grass finishing, diversity helps prevent off flavors in the animal. Plantain is a natural internal parasite control, so we add that into our mixes. We haven't used any wormers of any kind on our livestock for going on 10 years now. And the reason is there's no need to, because the diversity we have in these mixes helps control parasites. What we're really trying to do with these diverse mixes, though, is we're trying to optimize solar energy collection. And we have to start thinking of our farms and ranches as an energy cycle. We're trying to take energy out of the atmosphere and pump it into our soils in order to drive production. Take a look at this photo here. Look at all the different leaf sizes and shapes. What we're really doing is increasing photosynthetic capacity. In other words, the amount of sunlight that can be captured by our operation. And as you advance soil health, you'll be able to increase photosynthetic rate. In other words, the rate at which these plants are capable of photosynthesizing. It all begins with photosynthesis. The more photosynthesis, the more liquid carbon being pumped into the system. I really like this slide here. It was put together by Dr. Christine Jones. On the left of each of these sides of the graph are flax plants. On the right are sorghum plants. What this is depicting is, look at the difference in the amount of carbon that's being pumped into the soil. The flax plant's only pumping about 30% of its carbon into the soil, whereas the sorghum plant is pumping over 70% of its carbon into the soil. Now, why would it do that? Well, think of the difference in those plants. The sorghum plants needs to grow to a much bigger biomass, taller height, etc. It's going to pump more carbon into the soil to attract more biology so it can get the nutrients it needs for that growth. So that's one of the reasons on our operation, we grow a lot of sorghum sudan grass and corn, is let's pump the maximum amount of carbon we can into our soils. Some really fascinating work there that all producers should be looking at. The other thing we want to do, and I just want to mention briefly, is the importance of soil armor. We've got to keep that soil covered. This slide was taken on my operation one day. We had a tour. It was over 90 degrees air temp. Underneath the cover, it was 87 degrees, bare soil 107. What difference does that make? Look at that. When a soil is at 70 degrees, 100% of the moisture in the soil is available to the plants for growth. As that soil temp rises, those plants shut down. And this is the same on pasture land or cropland. Remember that. We have to keep armor on the soil surface, because as those soil temps rise, those plants shut down. How, as producers, do we make our living? It's simple. We have to have growing plants, right? So It's in our best interest to keep that armor on the soil and to keep those soil temperatures down. And I travel to a lot of areas in North America where I take soil temp readings 140 to 155 degrees. We're killing soil biology when soil temps reach that. So the residue really buffers the heat. Our heat here occurs usually in August, and we can keep those soil temps down. Here's a cover crop that I grew on less than 2 inches of moisture. This is my second cover. I grew the rye vetch, then I planted this very diverse warm season mix. Look at that growth we're getting on very little moisture. It can be done if you focus on these principles. When we're grazing a living cover, then we're priming that pump. There's some really good research out there that shows how these plants evolved were from animals grazing them. When an animal grazes a plant, that plant sends a signal, hey, I got to pump more carbon into the soil in order to attract biology so I can regrow. So we're actually benefiting our soils by having livestock grazing on them. And I think that's the missing link in a lot of cropland. You know, I can drive for hundreds of miles and not see a fence around cropland. Well, think of the negative impact on soil health by not integrating livestock back onto that cropland. We're also missing a tremendous profit potential by not doing so. Just some photos of these are some grass finishers on a sorghum Sudan based cover crop. Look at the amount of residue, that armor we're leaving. We're letting those cattle select for energy, and then in turn, the rest is to feed the soil. This is some economic data from a year ago on my operation. Take a look at what we achieved there. That group of finishers, 4.05 pounds average daily gain on there. Net profit per acre, $348. Plus, look at the difference on soil health. We're enhancing the health of our soil ecosystem. Now, the Brix reading on that cover crop where we averaged that gain was between 25 and 30. I don't know how familiar you are with Brix, but Brix is a measurement of the sugar content in liquid, and it really gives us a good indication of nutrient density. It's used in the wine industry all the time to determine when to harvest grapes. Well, we are using a refractometer all the time on our operation. We're moving our livestock in the afternoon. Your Brix is going to be higher in the afternoon when that plant is photosynthesizing. We can increase the average daily gain of our livestock by timing our moves accordingly. We put up hay using a refractometer. I don't know why anyone would cut hay in the morning when the Brix is lower. It'll have less nutrient quality. We need to be cutting forages, if we are cutting them, in the afternoon. Here's what we're seeing. Dr. Ellen Williams has done quite a bit of research on this. And for every 1 degree increase in Brix, we see the potential to increase average daily gain by 1/10 of a pound per day. In other words, moving from 5 Brix to 15 Brix equates to a 1 pound average daily gain increase. Yet how many producers are looking at this as they rotate through their perennial pastures or their cover crops? We need to be looking at that. Now, very quickly, if we do not graze during the growing season, we allow the plants to collect sunlight as long as possible. And then this is what we graze our cow-calf pairs on in the winter on our operation, is these diverse covers. North Dakota State University did some very good research where they tested these forages in August and they tested them again in late November. Look at that, hairy vetch, that calves there are eating hairy vetch, 18% crude protein the end of November. Why do I want to write checks for protein supplement when I can add these species to my cover crop mix and balance the protein and energy needs of my livestock? Millet falls off precipitously in both crude protein and TDN, so we do not put millet in much of our winter grazing mixes. Sorghum Sudan, very good at holding on to its crude protein and TDN, specifically the brown midrib type sorghum Sudan. Radish, I do not recommend radishes for grazing. There's other forage brassicas that will provide much better forage for grazing. Quickly, here's we're rejuvenating some old hay fields. This was an alfalfa field, a perennial alfalfa field. Hay had been removed for years. What we did in the fall of the year, when that alfalfa went dormant after a frost, we went in and seeded rye, hairy vetch, and radish in there. This is the next spring. We did not terminate the alfalfa. It's still alive underneath, but look at the production we got off that. There, we just strung a poly wire through there, and we're calving out cow-calf pairs on there. Doesn't do you any good to look for the calf. You're not going to find it till the next day. But they move through there. We're laying down a tremendous amount of biomass. Then we immediately come in with a very diverse warm season mix. Again, the alfalfa has not been terminated. It's still there, but we're seeding directly in there. Seeding equipment, good seeding equipment is a must, and Truax Company certainly has the equipment that would be able to seed into this type of a situation. We then went in there, seeded directly in there, and you can see underneath the alfalfa is still alive, but all these other species are coming. We're adding diversity to the mix. We're enhancing soil biology by feeding a diverse diet. This is just a photo a little later in the season. Look at that brassica. What livestock wouldn't want to eat on that? Then we ran cow-calf pairs in there just prior to a frost. I often get asked about prussic acid. We do not pay much attention to it on our operation. I just graze right through it. However, it can be an issue with sorghum sudan, so use some caution. I think our soil health is advanced, and with the diversity we have, we just don't pay much attention to that anymore. Okay, the second year then, I haven't done anything to that alfalfa. I went in real early with this combination. Forage oats, forage peas, brassica, turnip, crimson clover. And if you plant hairy vetch in the spring, it'll tend to act like an annual. So we put some of that in the mix also. Here we are running a poly wire through there. You can see again, very good production. Some volunteer vetch came there, and you see a little bit of volunteer rye, but that's okay. It's all enhancing nutrient cycling. Grazed cow-calf pairs on it again. There's some photos of us doing that, and there's what it looked like. Now think of it, we had removed the hay, the biomass from that field for so many years. We need to get armor on that soil surface, and there's that armor. That's what we want to see. Then we followed that again with another mix, and that mix we ended up grazing in the winter. Here's the result. We really improved aggregation and advanced soil health on that old hayland field. And now we've converted that into a perennial pasture. Regenerating thin stands. If you have perennial pastures that are thin, you must set back those perennials. One way to do that is very high stock density. And here you see that's about 750,000 pounds live weight per acre that we're putting on there. And you have two options. Either you can use a severe grazing at high stock density or chemical. The choice is yours. We prefer to use the severe grazing and take much more of that plant than we normally would. This will set back and retard the growth of those established perennials and give those annuals a chance to take off. This is some pretty good work that was done that shows that's the percent leaf area removed on the left, percent root growth retardation on the right. Look at that. If we take over 50% of the above ground leaf area, we're really going to retard that growth of that plant. So in order to set up those perennial pastures to give new seedlings a chance to establish, you may want to take a bit more. But this also shows the importance of not overgrazing perennial pastures in other circumstances. Truax makes drills that work well in this situation and are designed to interseed into perennial pastures. So I encourage you to look at their products as you move forward and try and establish and regenerate your pasture lands. Also, what I mentioned earlier in the broadcast, you want diversity in these mixes, at least 3 species of grasses, 3 of forbs, 3 of legumes. That would be a minimum in my book. And when we get that diversity, it's a diverse diet, not only for above ground animals, but below ground critters as well. Finishing up here, there was a number of questions often asked on how do I water on our ranch, because we don't have much in the form of surface water, no streams, lakes, running water. So we rely on well water. So we put shallow pipelines throughout our entire 5,000 acre ranch. And I use a design such as this. Notice it's not a straight line. Every one of those circled areas uh, depicts a water point. Then what we do is come in with one permanent, the yellow line indicates a permanent high tensile fence. And then the red lines are just one depiction of perhaps one way I can run my temporary fences off of that. So we have shallow pipelines incorporated throughout the ranch in order to get water to all the cropland fields and all of our perennial pastures. We do not believe in putting in much infrastructure in the way of permanent fences. Besides the outside fences, we're pretty much eliminating our interior fences and then just going with polywire because it provides us much, much more flexibility. So there's my email address. You can email me at any time and I'd be happy to get back to you. But right now, I'd rather cut this off so we can get to some questions. I'll turn it over to you, Daryl.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gabe. And before we get into the questions, again, just a reminder that we will be emailing the archived presentation of the webinar back to you so that you can go back through it at any time and review any of the information that Gabe presented. Obviously, there's some good slides with a lot of good information on there that you're probably going to want to review again. So yeah, I'll go ahead and there are a lot of great questions, and Gabe went through a lot of these that were presented ahead of time. We're going to try and get through as many as possible. And so just let me start with this one, Gabe. How do you overcome the problem of compacted soil from grazing cattle on cover crops? And how do you address compaction, from grazing, livestock each year and in a long-term situation?
That's a great question. And Dr. Jill Clapperton, who many of you know, she actually did some work here on our operation over a 3-year time frame where she would look at the soils right prior to high stock density livestock grazing on them while the animals were on there, and then 48 hours later. And what she found was compaction is all a function of time. If we're moving these livestock in a timely manner, and on our operation, we move during the growing season, we're moving our animals daily. There is virtually a very, very small time of about 48 hours where we see some surface compaction, but after that, it's alleviated because what she saw was due to the animal impact, dung, urine, etc., we're having a tremendous flush of soil bacteria following that, and they will actually alleviate those compaction issues. So what I tell people is compaction is all about our management. And if we're doing a good job of management, compaction is not an issue.
Okay. What would you say is the best approach if you're going to transition from a conventional farming, slash ranching system to one that's a soil health management system? There's probably a lot to that, but I don't know if you can best summarize that. So.
Yeah, that's a good question, and one I get asked multiple times daily. And I tell people, do what allows you to sleep at night. You know, I had a producer in northern Alberta who the first year he converted 8,000 acres first year. Now I have other producers who take one field, 5 or 10 acres. And I tell them, here's what it takes. Uh, Pick a field, a pasture, an area, and say, I'm going to try regenerative practices for 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, I'll see what happens. I have never, ever had anybody go all 5 years and then go back and not convert their entire operation to regenerative practices. Now, that's going to vary for each individual, but the big thing people need to understand is follow those 5 principles. There's an excellent book out there by John Sticka entitled A Soil Owner's Manual. I think it should be mandatory for every farmer and rancher out there because it lays out the 5 principles of soil health, talks about them. When you start integrating those principles, you're going to see the difference. And usually within 3 years, you'll see a marked improvement in water infiltration, aggregation, the life in the soil. You'll see earthworms coming back, and that will give you the encouragement to go on. So it's up to each individual, but just pick some acreage and move forward.
Okay, I think you kind of addressed this a little bit earlier, but it's probably worth raising again. Is the idea of sowing multiple seed types from the same seed box and all together, and how you do that? Could you touch on that again a little bit?
Yep. And, that's probably one of the most often asked questions I get is how do I set a drill? What do you do? Of course, it's going to vary a little bit from drill type to drill type, but just I found it works much better if you put all the seed together and then make sure the largest seed flows through, obviously, but that large seed will break away, as I tried to show in that photo, for the smaller seed. And as long as you're not going out and seeding 1,000 acres at a time, it's really not going to settle out a whole lot. And commonly in my environment, we're seeding, 100 to 160 acres of covers at a time. We just don't see much settling over that time. But it saves a lot of time and labor not putting it in multiple seed hoppers, etc. And I tell people that the most critical thing is getting good seed soil contact. So have the right equipment, get good seed soil contact, especially if you're seeding into perennial pasture type situations. Make sure you have the right equipment that can slice that furrow open, place the seed in, and then close that seed furrow so you get that seed soil contact for germination. But it really does work much better than most people would think it would.
Okay. We had a question from Australia, and our Australian friend here mentioned that cover crops there, they call them rotation crops or green fallow crops. But the question is, how can pests and diseases be controlled with cover crops?
Oh, that's a great question. And Dr. Jonathan Lundgren, who many of you may know, he's spoken at National No-Till Conference. He is one of the world's foremost authorities on insects in a healthy ecosystem. He just released a peer-reviewed paper, and we were fortunate enough that our ranch was one of the operations that was used in this study where Dr. Lundgren and his grad students, they did multiple locations in 5 different states over several years where they looked at those operations such as mine, which are using cover crops and not using any insecticides, any pesticides. And he compared them to farms and ranches near ours that were using insecticides and pesticides. And what he found was just amazing. I'm not going to quote exact figures, don't remember them off the top of my head, but it was like 100-fold increase in the amount of predator insects on the regenerative farms and ranches. That tied into a marked decrease in the amount of pests. He did not find any pests reaching a economically significant level on any of the operations that were farming regeneratively. So what we're doing on our operation is we have covers growing all the time. We have about 2,000 cropland acres on our operation. Of that, about 80% of those acres are in cash crops. The other 20% are in cover crops throughout the growing season. And those cover crops are being converted to dollars by grazing livestock, but those cover crops are also providing the home and habitat for the predator insects. And it's important to note, Dr. Lundgren told me For every insect species that's a pest, there's 1,700 that are beneficial. So here we are in production agriculture, spending all our time worrying about this pest. Shouldn't we worry about providing the home and habitat for the 1,700, of which many would eat that pest? I can honestly say I have spent zero, and I mean 0 minutes in the last 20 years worrying about a pest on any of my cash crops. It's just never an issue because we have the home and habitat for the predator insects.
Okay. Um, what is the common denominator for success with cover crops, and does climate have the last say?
There, I no matter where I travel, I have people come up to me and they say, "But Gabe, you don't understand. You don't understand. Our soils are different, our climate's different." And I look them in the eye and tell them, "But do you understand how ecosystems function?" Because those 5 principles are the same anywhere. And I'll never forget Dr. Ademir Caligari from Brazil, one of the world's foremost authorities on cover crops. He's worked in well over 60 countries all over the world. He told me this. He said, "You give me 2 inches of rainfall a year, 200 inches, anywhere in between, and I will grow you cover crops." Because there are species that are adapted to any environment. And Dr. Caligari told me the first thing he does when he travels to a new country to help them with cover cropping is he goes for a walk in their native ecosystems and looks what type of species of plants are growing. Because if they've survived there, that means they should be a cover crop. In Western Australia, I know producers who very dry, arid environments, what they're doing is they're growing a wheat crop, for instance, then they're letting the native species come, and they, as native species, will serve as the cover crop in the off season, so to speak. So there's ways we can work around that. Too many people, they get their mind wrapped in a box that they have to grow like the daikon radish or something. There's just a few species of covers. We've tried well over 100 different species of covers on our operation in order to find those that really work. And I encourage producers, Gabe Brown cannot sit here and tell you what cover crop to grow on your operation. Only you can determine that. But don't be afraid to experiment, and don't be afraid of failures. Failures are nothing but learning tools. My son and I try very hard to fail at several things every year, because if we're not failing, we're not trying enough new things. Just make your failures small, make them learning opportunities.
Okay. Kind of follow up on some of these climate questions here, and obviously that's always a big concern. But one of them was uh, talking about how they are in a summer rainfall area and they have very dry winters where they just get frost but really no snow. Their question is, can we do winter cover crops after corn or soybeans? What do you think?
Yeah, what I'm saying in that type of an environment, maybe you should be looking at other cash crops. And I showed you the profitability, I saw from over the past years from my rye and vetch. And it amazes me how many people they're trying to fit covers only into their cropping scenario, and they're not looking at the covers as a profit potential. See, not only will the covers be able to cycle you more nutrients, improve soil health, the gentleman or lady who asked the question, obviously in a drier type environment, well, they should be coming at it from the standpoint, how do I improve the water holding capacity of my soils? For every 1% increase in organic matter in our soils, we can hold approximately 18 to 25,000 more gallons of water. So when I started, my soils less than 2% organic matter, I could hold less than 40,000 gallons of water per acre. Now here I am, well over 7% organic matter on many of my fields. I can hold 140,000 gallons of water. So that's the questions these producers should be asking is, how do I use covers in order to advance soil health to benefit my operation, make it more resilient? And in order to do that, they may have to change and tweak, at least partially, some of their crop rotation in order to advance soil health further, thus increasing their profitability overall.
Okay. This is a good tester here. Can you implement cover crops if you have 1 inch of rain in your fallow season? Say it's about a 6 month season. And if so, how could you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer is obviously yes, because again, tying into what I just said on the last answering the last question, it comes down to you have to grow something. And I tell people, when I started down this path, I didn't realize where it was going to lead me, and I had no idea what soil health is when I started. But I can't tell you the number of times I seeded a cover crop and it only got 2 or 3 inches tall. And many people would consider that a failure. But 2 or 3 inches above ground equates to 6 or 8 inches below ground. And every year it got better. So the way I would answer that question is you find the most drought tolerant species out there that are adapted to your area and you start planting them. And
Mhm.
just realize there's no way you will advance soil health without a living plant. Ray Archuleta, Ray the soil guy, said it best when he said, plant and soil are one. You cannot advance soil health without growing plants, and we cannot afford that gap of time. Too many people believe in drier environments, oh, I have to chem fallow the land so I can store water. But that's not how nature works. Nature works through a living plant. The only way they're going to improve their soil and build resiliency is by growing plants. So you have to grow something.
Okay. Here's a question that I'm sure you've heard before in regards to chemical fertilizer, but what is the shortest period that you can increase your soil health conditions with regenerative farming and stop using chemical fertilizer?
Yeah, and that question, that's kind of a loaded question because I would need to know a lot more specifics. And one of the things we do at Soil Health Consulting is when we start consulting on farms and ranches, we go in and we do a myriad of soil tests. We do the Haney test, we do PLFA tests to find out what kind of biology is there. Only once we know that can we kind of determine, okay, this is where those soils are at. Here's what we need to do to regenerate them. And it will vary. But in all honesty, I have seen producers in 3 years virtually cut 75+% of their synthetic inputs while increasing profitability at the same time. Often there's this belief that when we go down this regenerative path, there's going to be a period where we lose money. Uh, we consider it a failure if we don't uh, have our producers, if they're not profitable from year one. You can be very profitable moving down this regenerative path. Realize, and I tell people this, I will take profit over yield any day. And there's a huge difference between the two. I don't care whether we're talking from a grazing standpoint or from a cash grain yield standpoint. There's a huge difference between profit and yield. And I tell you what, I have neighbors around me who will out yield me any year, but I will compare bank accounts anytime they want. And there's a big difference.
Okay. Had a question that popped up here a moment ago, but if you want to just pop back to that question there. Yeah, the question was, does it make sense to let part of your cover crops mature for seed to be collected? Do you do any of that at all or not?
That's a very good question. And what I tell you producers is in your environment, if it's adapted to if the species you're seeding, if you can combine it for seed, now obviously you have to be cognizant of all the seed laws out there and the variety protection. But why not do that? The hairy vetch and rye that I'm seeding on my operation originated from the first seed I got in 1994. So I more or less have my own variety. It's just to know it's a slam dunk no-brainer for me. It overwinters and it thrives every year. And so I encourage producers to combine their own seed if at all possible. Now, several of the species I do use, like sorghum, Sudan grass, etc., we're not able to get that to maturity in our environment. So there I have to buy seed. But I'm producing as much of my own seed as I can.
Okay. This question is when can I move from planting annuals twice a year to using perennials for grazing? And side note, this individual says that their soil is becoming healthier each year. Uh,
Very
Thoughts?
good question. That's a very good question. And I relate it to this. I encourage every producer to have a spade and carry it with them every time they go in the field and really get to know their soils. You know, most the past several years, we've had well over 2,500 visitors each summer to our ranch. And the first thing they'll notice about me is I always get a spade with me and I'm looking at my soil. And I can tell people, I know for a fact I've dug in my neighbor's soils way, way more than they have. In fact, my adjacent neighbors, I have never, ever once seen them look at their soil. And so they have no idea in their mind, soil's just a medium to hold the plant upright. So you can really see soil health. I often get asked, what's the best soil test, excuse me, to take? And I show them a shovel. And I said, look at it. Is it well aggregated? You can smell the difference. Bacterial dominant soil is very pungent. If you're moving towards a more fungal dominant soil, it's got a very mild, almost neutral smell to it. And you'll see the aggregation and you'll be able to tell. Look at when a road is built, when the uh, highway department or so comes in and builds a road. What's the first thing that shows up on the side of the road? It's the forbs. Some may call them weeds, but they're actually forbs. They're first, then you see annual grasses, and then after a few years, you start seeing perennials. And I tell people who are looking to move into a perennial situation, you start with covers and you advance soil health to the point that you're getting good infiltration, you're getting nutrient cycling, and then you seed it to perennials. I strongly recommend multiple cover crops for 2 years before seeding perennials. And I made that mistake myself back in the early 90s. I took 200 acres of cropland, seeded it to perennials. I got a beautiful stand, but it's a poor stand. There wasn't the nutrient cycling, there wasn't the water infiltration, and I suffered with that for years until I figured out I needed to add diversity. You're much more better off to go in first with a series of covers and then seed it to perennials. So to answer that producer's question, he's probably ready to start seeding it to perennials.
Okay. Question here about, or really a statement more, if you would discuss the possibility of rotating in temporary perennial grass legume stands for grazing, and they also wants to understand what is the impact of the loss of cover crop residue from grazing.
There is a balance there. First of all, answering the first part of the question, look at the studies that were done in Iowa, and it goes back, many call them the Iowa studies, where they looked at systems where it was 3 years in perennials, then 3 years in cash crops. That's still the most profitable system out there. On our operation, we have moved into just that. We are seeding a lot of our cropland acres back to perennials in order to advance soil health. And then the goal down the road, we will, after a number of years, take some of those acres out of perennials and put them back into cash grain productions for a few years and then back into perennials. So that's a great system. It's highly profitable when managed correctly. And it's all about cycling uh, carbon. So we can do this. And I will let the listeners know we're part of a long-term study here. We just had a team of soil scientists here, and they took 170 soil probes 4 feet deep on our operation. And where I once had A horizon soils in the 5 to 6 inch range, we now have some parts of our cropland that have reached 29 inches of A horizon topsoil. So we can grow topsoil tremendously by using these types of rotations.
Okay. This individual is a consultant who's got customers in Northeast Iowa and Southwest Wisconsin. But you kind of talked about this earlier, but in regards to grazing cover crops, is cereal rye the best choice?
Well, from a strictly a grazing standpoint, no. There's many more species that from a nutritional quality for the livestock that are better. Now, from a soil health standpoint, cereal rye will, because of its tremendous root mass, will benefit the soils, but I would certainly add diversity to that. I would add species to that. You never want to be, well, let me put it this way. A monoculture cover crop is better than nothing, but boy, a polyculture is 10 times better than that. So add diversity if possible to that. And as far as particular species, that's going to vary region to region. So I just don't answer those types of questions.
Gotcha. How can I set back orchard grass and bird's foot trefoil without killing it and seed more species?
Yep, that gets back to the slides I showed, severe overgrazing. And that's the way to do that. And then you go in. Now, I often get asked, can we broadcast the seed or do we need to drill it? That what we're seeing is in wetter type environments or under irrigation, broadcasting will work. In drier environments such as mine, you're much better off to go with a drill, a good drill such as a Truex, and go in and seed into those perennials. But you need to set them back first. If you don't want to use chemicals, and I try and encourage people to get away from chemical use as much as possible, then go with the severe overgrazing.
Okay. And it's a good bridge for us to get in a couple weed control type of questions here. How do you deal with thistles? I've seen a few of those growing up on the dairy farm in our pasture land.
Yep. And one thing to remember is all quote unquote weeds serve a purpose. Um, you look at musk thistle or Canada thistle, our livestock graze Canada thistle readily. So I never consider that an issue. We're able to go in and convert it into nutrition for livestock. Um, most times in those situations, with proper grazing management, you can certainly keep them in check. And it all comes down to stock density and then timing of when you have the livestock on there. And livestock will be able to keep them in check. Remember, though, that I often run into producers who their first reaction when they see some of these forbs or weeds is to go out and spray them. But remember, so often those forbs are cycling nutrients from deep in the soil profile, and it's benefiting the nutrients that are available to the other species. So I would be very, very hesitant to go out and try and eliminate all of them.
Okay. Any opinions on what are the best cover crops for pre-plant weed control?
The best ones I've found in my environment, hands down, are cereal rye. We get really good residual with that. And the other is sorghum Sudan grass. So what I'm doing in my environment, and I didn't have time to get in it in the webinar, but we will actually use the previous year's cover crop to inhibit the following year's weeds. So we go in with a very diverse cover. A large percentage of that would be sorghum Sudan. Graze it with livestock. It's terminated by frost. And then you saw in the webinar the photos of that mat of residual forage we have on the soil surface that inhibits weeds the following year. And getting back, I didn't finish answering a previous question where they asked about how do you balance how much of the above ground biomass to take off of a cover crop. Normally, I do not like to graze more than a third of the above ground biomass. So we're going to take 1/3 and leave 2/3. That's just a rough rule of thumb we have on our operation. And when I consult on operations, I tell them Rarely would I take over 50%. We're going to leave at least 50% of the above ground biomass for that armor to protect that soil surface.
Okay. This question is, what are the best methods for restoring marginal dry land that has been actively tilled for 50 plus years? And we're talking particularly when it comes to weed control.
And I can answer this one because that was the exact situation I was in. 50 plus years of, I often said my father-in-law practiced recreational tillage. He just went to till for the enjoyment of sitting in a tractor. And so what I would do now, knowing what I know now, I would do 2 years of diverse cover crop rotations with livestock integration into there, converting. We need to be profitable. So it doesn't do us any good to talk soil health and on all this if we're not profitable. So we're gonna seed the diverse cover crop mixes, but we're gonna convert them to dollars with grazing livestock. And 2 years of that, they will be amazed at the difference it makes in soils. And if we use the right species, we will be able to inhibit weed production. Realize in many of these severely degraded soils, we were working on operation in New Mexico, severely degraded cropland soils, where we actually allowed the weeds to grow and use the weeds. We graze them with livestock, but use them as the initial jump start to get some carbon cycling. And then we went in with cover crops. If the situation is that degraded, that is an option.
Okay. What were some of the key, I guess, landscape function signals or signs or observational changes that you saw when you were weaning your system back off of fertilizer? What were some of the things that you kind of saw occurring and happening out there on your property?
Yeah, great question. The first thing, without a doubt, is I noticed aggregation, and I noticed my fields and pastures had the ability to infiltrate. It was not uncommon when in my early years when we were doing tillage, a half-inch rainfall event would see water ponded everywhere. And uh, the first year my wife and I bought this place from her parents, NRCS come out and they did infiltration studies. We could only infiltrate a half of an inch of rainfall per hour. Now that's not very good infiltration, but that's how destroyed the soil structure was from all the tillage passes. Now, just here 2 years ago, a team of soil scientists were out doing multiple infiltration tests. They found we have fields where we can infiltrate an inch in 9 seconds and the second inch in 16 seconds. So 2 inches in 25 seconds. That's a marked improvement from a half inch per hour. So that's what I noticed the first thing. Second thing was the earthworms. As I dug in the soil with the spade, I noticed I had earthworms, which we never saw before. And then I think it's important to note, and don't get me wrong here, I'm not saying remove all your synthetics. If you do that immediately, you'll have a wreck. Soil is like a drug addict. You got to wean it off these inputs slowly. But when Dr. Chris Nichols was on my place in 2004 and challenged me to remove my synthetics, when I did so, I noticed an immediate marked increase in the aggregation of my soils. And the reason was when I was applying the synthetics, when you do that, the bacteria are going to feed on that, and then they're going to look for bacteria are going to explode the populations, and they're going to look for a food source, and that food source is going to be the carbon that binds soil aggregates together. So by applying synthetics, you're actually decreasing the aggregation of your soil. When I remove the synthetics, soil aggregation just immediately took a giant leap forward. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so strongly committed to trying to get producers to at least back off of the amount of synthetics they're using. And a good way to do that is by using the Haney soil test. it will give you a good indication of how much you can start backing off of these synthetic inputs.
Okay. So how do you go about terminating any perennials when you want to go back to a cash crop? And there's some of the
Yeah.
questions about terminating covers and how you deal with it on your place.
Yeah, with the covers, I use winter to my advantage. One of the things about living in North Dakota, most things will winter kill up here. So we use that to our advantage. Now, if you're in a climate, down south where you don't have winter, you've got two choices. Well, three really. You can use a crop roller to terminate it, or you can use chemical, or you can use tillage. Now, I'm not going to make that choice for people. That's up to each person to decide what to use. Now, with perennials, obviously a crop roller is not going to terminate them. So you're left with either chemicals or tillage. And I'm consulting on a couple large organic operations in the South, and there to terminate the perennials, we are using a tillage pass, but it's our goal to use one tillage pass every 5 to 6 years down there. You see, because we're using a tillage pass to terminate the perennials, but then we're going no-till for the rest of the time. Now, obviously, I'd like to eliminate that tillage pass, but we don't quite have it figured out yet.
Yep. And we've talked before too. You do say, where you need to, you do use some herbicide where in your operation where you need to. So,
Absolutely. And I've just made the decision in my mind, herbicide is less detrimental than the tillage. But that's for each person to decide. And I'm not going to chastise anyone for what they decide. Do what's best for your own situation.
okay. This is a grower from Western Kansas asked, what would keep the mycorrhizal network alive all winter? Um, Thoughts on that one?
Well, realize plants are active even during the winter. So as long as you had something growing as long as possible throughout the growing season, the mycorrhizal fungi is going to be there. And I think this is one of the new frontiers, so to speak, in soils, is realizing the importance that fungi play in the ecosystem. Dr. David Johnson from New Mexico State University is doing some outstanding work on the importance of fungi to these plants, and what he's found that new seedlings of most all species, now brassicas not included because most brassicas are non-mycorrhizal, the most important thing to them early on is they're forming their association with fungi. So producers so often in production agriculture worried about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc. No, the most important thing to a new seedling is fungi. Yet how many of us as producers are providing the opportunity for that fungi to proliferate? Really some good work. Google Dr. David Johnson and you can watch and listen to his work.
Okay. We'll do a couple more questions here before we wrap up. What is the best way you found to drill a perennial grass mix into existing alfalfa?
Yeah, the best way I've found is to wait until, if you're in a northern region and that alfalfa goes dormant, then go in there and do a dormant seeding. And with the right equipment, you can seeding into an existing alfalfa stand isn't a problem. Go in there and seed it early, and then the following year, what we do is we graze across it and set that alfalfa back a little bit. Now, some of the people might want to hay it, but you need to set it back a little bit and give those other species a chance to proliferate.
Okay. How about if you're going to follow dryland wheat harvest with a cover crop for grazing? What's the best way to drill there? Best thing you can do.
That has been one of the big challenges of cover cropping. When you take from my environment here in central North Dakota on west through Montana, usually our rainfall shuts off by the 4th of July, and we won't get any moisture until October, late September, October. Well, that's not conducive to growing a cover crop, obviously. So one of the things I've started doing is we're actually intercropping legumes into our cash grains like spring wheat, barley, etc. So what we'll do is when we seed the spring wheat, for example, I'll seed several types of lower growing clover, such as a subterranean or a crimson. Now you're going to want to make sure you don't have a semi-dwarf wheat if you're spring wheat, if you're straight combining it. But we'll seed them at the same time right away in the spring, and then the legume starts growing and it's alive. So when we come in and straight combine off that wheat, we already have an established legume growing in there, and that becomes our cover crop. We found that's by far the best in these drier environments.
Okay, well, we're going to wrap it up there. Just a reminder that we're going to be making available via email to you a replay of today's webinar in the event you'd like to go back and review the entire presentation or some parts of it. That replay of that webinar is also going to go up on our No-Till Farmer website shortly. There is an archive section where you can go back and listen to other No-Till Farmer webinars from the past. So we're going to make that available to you because obviously a lot of great information shared by Gabe today, and there's a lot of good stuff in his slides. And before we conclude, just a heads up that when you log off, there's going to be a questionnaire for you to complete, a very simple set of questions. Your answers will help us determine the value of today's webinar and also help us with planning for future webinars. And if we didn't get to your question today, feel free to send a note to Gabe. He's very willing and helpful with answering any questions you might have, and we had a ton of them, so we thank you for that. I want to thank Gabe again for leading this discussion, and once again thank Truax Company, the makers of the On-the-Go Seed Drill and the Flex 2 Series Grass Drill, for sponsoring today's No-Till Farmer webinar. You can learn more about those drills at truaxcomp.com. That's spelled TRUAXCOMP.com. I also want to thank our producer today, Rachel Hanrahan, for making sure everything went smoothly for us. So I'm going to wish you all a great rest of your day and say goodbye for now.